Hey everyone, welcome back to Constant Learners. In today's video, we are discussing the two-tier and three-tier architecture of the database management system. We will discuss the different layers present and understand this with the help of real-life examples. All right, let's get started. The database architecture involves the development, maintenance, and implementation of database management system. All right. The architecture is nothing but a way of structuring the communication. Communication between who? The user and the database. And why? So that the user can efficiently manage and access critical information that has been organized systematically in the database. All right. The main purpose here is to design and construct a robust database for large enterprise systems, which would be capable of effectively managing large volumes of data. All right, for that particular organization. Now, the data can be present anywhere on the web servers. That is, we don't know the exact location of the data. Thus, we need a network connection to be able to communicate with the database. All right, and we also need a proper architecture. All right, so that the users can communicate with the data inside the database. And for that, we need the two-tier and the three-tier architecture. All right. Now, the person who is directly communicating with the database. So, this is the user who is directly trying to communicate with the database. That person is known as the client. All right. And the machines where the database systems are running are known as the servers. Okay, so this is important because through the entire video we are going to hear the client and the server multiple times. So it's important that we know that client is the person who is directly trying to access the database, and the server is the machine where the database systems are running. All right, now depending upon the organization's requirement, the database management system architecture can be either two-tier or three-tier. So two-tier and three-tier architecture are the multi-tier architectures because there are multiple tiers. Tiers are nothing but layers. Okay, tiers are nothing but layers. Okay, so the two-tier and three-tier architecture are mainly used as per the organization's requirement, the way they want to communicate with the database, or the way they want the client to be able to communicate with the database. But there's also a single tier architecture. In single tier architecture, the database, the server, and the client, all of them are available in a single machine. All right. The client means the client is actually the interface that the client is using to be able to communicate with the database on the database server. So everything, the client interface, the database, and the server, all of that is available on a single machine. All right. This architecture is obviously very rarely used. It's mostly used in the beginning stages when you're learning to build the databases. All right, let's head to the two-tier architecture. All right, let's say I want to go watch a movie in the multiplex. Okay, so this is me, don't judge my drawing. So what will I do? I will go to the multiplex. In the multiplex, first I'll go to the ticket counter. All right, at the ticket counter, I will ask the person about the different shows available. Let's say I want to watch the movie Fast and Furious. So I'll ask him, tell me what are the timetables of the shows available. All right, so this person will access his system and try to fetch the details that I am asking for. So when he is accessing the system, what exactly is he doing? He is checking his database, all right, and fetching the details for me. Then I tell him, okay, I want to book the tickets for this particular show. He'll again go check the database, which seats are available, and then he will tell me, all right, so and so seats are available. Then I'll tell him, okay, in this particular row, book 4 tickets. So again, he will enter the details inside the database that these tickets or these seats are now booked and they are not available for future clients or customers. All right. Now, the person that is directly accessing the database, we say that he is the client. So, in this case, the person sitting at the ticket counter is the client. All right. And the machine that he is using is known as the client machine. All right. And database is available on the server. All right. This is exactly what two-tier architecture is. The client is directly accessing the database on the server. Okay. Now the client has an interface. All right. The client has an interface. But on this interface, is the client entering any kind of queries? Are we entering any kind of SQL queries? Does the person sitting at the ticket counter know the SQL queries? No. He is entering the data in a language that he understands. All right. So the client machine has to convert that language, the language that the client is entering, he has to convert that language into a machine language that the machine will understand. All right. Then this client machine will establish a connection with the database. Okay. So this is nothing but the connection. How this is happening, that I'll explain when we get into the technicalities of the two-tier architecture. But right now, the client establishes the connection with the database. All right. So the client machine is sending the query to the database. So the database server has to process this query. All right. And also it has database management system that stores, manages or accesses the data from the database and then finally responds to the client. All right. So here we have the client machine. We have the client machine, which is also known as the presentation layer. And then we have the server, that is the database server, which is the data layer. All right. So client machine, which is the presentation layer, has a user interface. All right. Which is actually the graphical user interface or the command line interface. So the client machine has a graphical user interface. The user enters the data through this graphical user interface. And how is the user entering the data? There are probably some text boxes wherein we enter the details or some check boxes that the client needs to check. This is how we are entering the data. We are not writing any SQL queries. No. So through this graphical user interface, the user is entering the data and this data is then converted into machine language, okay, or low level language. And for that, we need an application logic. So client machine has an application logic that converts the details that the user is entering. All right. This application logic could be present with the server also. All right. So this application logic converts the details that the client is entering into a language that the machine can understand. Okay. Now, once the query is ready, the client machine needs to establish a connection with the database server. All right. So, a connection needs to be established with the database server. So, this client machine has an API, that is application program interface. All right. This API establishes the connection with the database server through JDBC, that is Java Database Connectivity, and ODBC, that is Open Database Connectivity. Alright, so client has a graphical user interface or command line interface, which is nothing but an interface that the client is using or the user is using to enter the details. Alright, and these details are then converted into a program, okay, using an application logic. So the application logic is converting the details that the user is entering into a machine language. All right. Then to establish the connection, the client machine has an API that establishes the connection with the database server through JDBC and ODBC. All right. Now once the connection has been established, all right, the connection has been established, then it comes to the data layer. Right, the query has now come to the data layer. In the data layer, we have the database server. And what does the database server do? First, it processes the queries. Okay, it processes the query. All right, then it has a database management system. So the database management system is present with the database server, and we know what the database management system does. It manages the data inside the database. So whatever request the client is making, the database processes that requests and fetches that data. So if I am requesting for a particular data, this database management system will visit the database, look for that particular data and return it back to the client. If I am trying to store some kind of data inside the database, then again database management system will open the database, go to the particular table and store the data inside the database. So it is a job of database management system to manage or store the data inside the database. Alright, so this data layer is interacting directly with the presentation layer. That is, the client and the database server are interacting with each other directly. Alright, the presentation layer is making a request to the data layer. The database management system inside the data layer performs the tasks or processes the queries and fetches the data and returns it back to the presentation layer or to the client. Alright, I hope the two-tier architecture was clear. Now, the two-tier architecture, the overall architecture is very simple. Okay, so of course the maintenance is also going to be very simple. It's going to be very easy. Maintenance is going to be very easy. However, only limited authorized people can access the data from the database. Like here, the person sitting at the ticket counter can only access the data from the database. We cannot do that. So we can say that there is limited access. That means if multiple users want to simultaneously access the data in the database, that is not possible. So we can say that there is no possibility of scalability. Alright, then another disadvantage could be security. This system is not very secure because the client is directly accessing the data from the database server. So the security is not very strong. All right, also if the organization grows, the data grows, the maintenance could be difficult. The data maintenance of data in the database could be difficult. Why? Because the database server has to perform the task of processing the queries, right? Processing and then fetching or storing the data inside the database. So everything is being performed by the database server, and thus if multiple users are simultaneously trying to access the database, then in that case, there's going to be a lot of traffic and the system is going to be very slow. All right. So the data is not secure. There is limited access. There is an issue of scalability. All right. So these are the disadvantages of two-tier architecture. Also, nowadays, not everyone wants to stand in the queue to book the tickets, right? People prefer booking the tickets online, right? Then in that case, we would need an access to the database directly, which is not possible in the two-tier architecture. Thus, we need the three-tier architecture for that. What happens if I want to book a ticket online? What will I do? I will directly open my cell phone or maybe my laptop. Through my laptop, I will try to visit to the website, right? The website for that particular multiplex. Through that, I'll try to book the ticket, or maybe I will use some kind of app. These days, the banking apps that we use, they have a feature of booking the movie tickets online or making any kinds of payments online. So I can use either any kind of mediator apps or maybe go to the multiplex's website and book the ticket online. I'm going to enter my details, the show that I want to book the tickets for, the seats that I want to book, and finally enter my details, the bank details, and book the tickets online. As easy as that, right? So the client is entering the details through the website or an application, and this is communicating with the database to book the ticket. So what the client is seeing on his cell phone is actually an interface, that is a user interface, right? Let's say I'm using a bank's app to book the tickets. Now the bank will have to, the app that I'm using will have to communicate with the database which belongs to the multiplex, right? Because I need the details about the movies that is running in that particular multiplex, right? So the bank's app will have to communicate with the multiplex's database. Is that possible? Will one organization give the details about their databases to another organization? That's not possible, right? So in this case, the user, the client will only have a user interface, okay, in the form of that app. That app will then communicate with a mediator, and that mediator will then communicate with the database. All right. So I am requesting for a particular information from the multiplexes database. I need certain details about the shows, about the seats that are available. So what am I doing? I'm just entering the details on my interface that I have on my mobile screen or my computer screen, and I'm entering those details in a language that I understand, right? That is not a computer language. Okay, so I'm just entering the details here. These details are then being sent to a mediator app. All right, this mediator app then communicates with the database then responds to the request that was sent to the mediator app, and the mediator app will then give the data to the client on his interface. All right, so here on the interface I'm entering the data in a simple English language through text boxes or check boxes. This data, when it goes to the mediator app, it gets converted into a machine language, a language that the machines can understand, a low level language. After getting converted into the low level language, it is then sent to the database. Database responds to the mediator in, of course, the low level language only. So the mediator will then have to convert it into a language that the client can understand and send it back to the client. I hope that it was clear. Let's understand this in the technical format. So now in three-tier architecture also, we have a presentation layer and a data layer. But the new layer that is being added is the business layer. So first we have the presentation layer, second we have the business layer, and third we have the data layer. So business layer is acting as a mediator between the presentation layer and the data layer. In two-tier architecture, the presentation layer and the data layer were directly communicating with each other. But in three-tier architecture, they cannot directly communicate with each other. They will have to go through the business layer. All right. Now, in case of three-tier architecture, the client machine only has a user interface. All right, a user interface wherein the user enters the details in a language that user can understand. All right, so the language is a language that user can understand. In that language, the user is entering the details. This is only happening in the client layer, all right, in the presentation layer. Earlier in two-tier architecture, we had the user interface, then we had the application logic that was converting the uh, our details into a machine language. Then we also had an API that was establishing the connection with the database server. But all of this is not required in case of the client layer in three-tier architecture. In three-tier architecture, the presentation layer or the client machine only has a user interface to enter the details. All right. Now, when the details are entered, these details then go to the business layer. All right. These details are sent to the business layer. Now, in business layer, there is an application logic. All right. And this application logic transforms our query into a low level language. Low level language is the machine language that the machine can understand, that the database server will understand. All right, so application logic is converting the query that the user is entering in his language that he understands in a format that the user understands. The application logic converts that details in the form of a query in the low level language. All right, so the queries that we are receiving from the client layer are getting processed in the business layer, right? Earlier in two-tier architecture, the query was being processed in the database server, right? The processing was taking place in the database server, which was burdening the database server, right? But in this case, the query is being processed in the business layer. That means the burden on the database server has reduced, right? So all the requests that the client is making comes to the business layer, all right? Now, why do we need to convert the query into a low level language? Because machine cannot understand our language, right? It is, we are entering the details in a format that we understand, but it needs to be converted into a format that machine can understand, right? So business layer is using application logic to convert the details that we are entering into a low level or machine language. All right. I hope that this much was clear. Now, once the query has been processed, it is then sent to the data layer, right? Now, in the data layer, that is in the database server, in case of three-tier architecture, we only have the database management system, right? In two-tier architecture, the query was being processed in the database server, and then the database management system was performing the required task. But in case of three-tier architecture, we are getting a completely ready query here, and the database server only has to use the database management system to perform the required task inside the database, right? Whether it is about storing the data, managing the data, manipulating the data, or accessing the data. All of that tasks are being performed by the database management system. All right. So as soon as the database server receives the request or the query from the business layer, the database management system performs the required task and responds to the business layer. All right. Sends the data or the request that the business layer had made, it sends it back to the the business layer. All right. Now, once the data has been received from the database server into the business layer, the data is now in the form of a language that only machines can understand, right? It is in a low level language. So, this business layer will again use the application logic to transform the data into a language that user can understand, that is the user's language, right? It will transform the data in a language that user can understand, and then finally respond to the client, send the response to the client in a format that client can understand, right? Now when the data is returned from the data layer, it goes to the business layer. Business layer transforms this data into a format that is understandable by the client, because the client may not understand the format in which the data is being returned from the data layer, right? So it needs to be converted into a language that the user can understand, and that happens in the business layer with the help of the application logic. All right. I hope that this much was clear. So the client is receiving the data in a language that he can understand, in a format that he can understand. All right. Like for example, if I can speak only Hindi, I can only understand Hindi, and you can only speak English, right? I'm going to talk to you in Hindi and expect a response in Hindi as well. But you don't know how to speak Hindi, so you are going to respond to me in English and expect the response in English, right? So in that case, we will need a mediator, and this business layer is nothing but a mediator. All right. All right. So first layer in three-tier architecture is the presentation layer, which is nothing but the client machine. All right. And client machine only has the user interface, wherein the user enters the details in a language that user can understand, right? Then this details are sent to the second layer, which is the business layer. Business layer has the application logic. This application logic transforms the details that the user has sent from the client machine, from the first layer, into a low level language that the machine can understand. Then after the query is processed, it is sent to the third layer, which is the data layer. All right. And data layer has the database server. All right. Database server has database management system that performs the required task and responds to uh, the request that the client has made. It sends the data to the business layer. Then again, the data that has been sent by the data layer is in the machine language, which the client cannot understand. So again, it will be job of the business layer to transform it into a language that the client can understand, and finally send the data or the request that the client had made back to the client. All right. I hope that three-tier architecture was clear. All right. Now the advantages of three-tier architecture. First advantage is multiple users can simultaneously access the database. That is, concurrent access is possible. All right. Thus, the problem of scalability has been reduced. That is, in two-tier architecture, the scalability was not possible, but in three-tier architecture, it is very easy because multiple users can simultaneously access the data in the database. All right. Then the security here is more. Why the security is more? Because in two-tier architecture, the client was directly accessing the data from the database, right? But now in three-tier architecture, they have to go through a mediator. All right. So the data is secure. Also, the burden on the database server has reduced because the processing of the query, that part is now given to the business layer, and the burden on the database has reduced. All right. And what is the disadvantage? Maintenance could be a problem because the the structure here is a little complex and multiple users are simultaneously trying to access the database. So maintenance could be a problem, but that is not something that cannot be managed. All right. So that is it. That was a brief overview of two-tier and three-tier architecture. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for joining us in this learning journey. Feel free to leave your questions or suggestions in the comments below. Until next time, keep on learning and exploring. Bye bye.